Thank you very much. The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts, international cooperation in combating terrorism 20 years after the adoption of Resolution 1373 in 2001. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Under Secretary-General, United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, Ms. Michelle Conins, Executive Director, Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate, and Ms. Fatima Akilu, Executive Director of NEEM Foundation. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2020/1315, a letter dated 30 December 2020 from the Permanent Representative of Tunisia to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary-General, transmitting a concept note on the item under consideration. I wish to warmly welcome ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. The Council has before it the text of a statement by the President on behalf of the Council on the subject of today's meeting. I thank the Council members for their valuable contributions to the statement. In accordance with the understanding reached among the members of the Council, I shall take it that the members of the Security Council agree to the statement, which will be issued as a document of the Security Council under the symbol S/PRST/2021/1. I now give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Voronkov. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, distinguished representatives. Allow me to begin by commending Tunisia on its leadership role as the chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee and salute this important initiative of its presidency of the Security Council. 20 years ago, the Council took a momentous step to bolster the fight against the threat posed by terrorism to international peace and security. It's hard to overstate the importance of the Council's rapid action to adopt Resolution 1373 and establish the Counter-Terrorism Committee in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I want to pay tribute to the victims of these heinous attacks. Almost 3,000 people from 90 countries, and to all those around the world whose lives have been shattered by the scourge of terrorism over the years. Throughout the last 2 decades, the threat of terrorism has persisted, evolved, and spread, causing unspeakable human suffering and loss. Al-Qaeda has proven resilient despite the loss of numerous leaders. It pioneered a dangerous transnational model of regional franchises, exploiting local fragilities and conflicts. The so-called Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant was able to harness social media to mobilize and recruit followers worldwide, creating a foreign terrorist fighter phenomenon of an unprecedented scale. In the face of these threats, this Council has provided critical impetus and guidance for member states to demonstrate unity of purpose and action, stepping up national efforts and international cooperation. This has led to important successes, helping member states to bring terrorists to justice and to disrupt additional attacks. ISIL's territorial aspirations in Iraq and Syria were defeated, but it still remains a threat in the region, conducting attacks and seeking to reconstitute an external operation capability. Urgent challenges remain to ensure accountability for the crimes perpetrated by ISIL and to repatriate thousands of associated foreign nationals, mostly women and children, who remain in limbo. Terrorist activity has shown that we must remain extremely vigilant. The threat remains real and even direct for many states. Terrorists have sought to exploit disruptions arising from COVID-19. They have sought to benefit from the setbacks to the development and human rights agendas, riding on the wave tops of polarization and hate speech amplified by the pandemic. The threat has become even more difficult to prevent with low-cost, low-tech attacks against soft targets by so-called lone wolves. Terrorists are adapting quickly, keen to exploit cyberspace and new technologies, linkages with organized crime, as well as regulatory, human, and technical gaps in national capacities. Their tactics are appealing to new groups across the ideological spectrum, including racially, ethnically, and politically motivated violent extremist groups. The COVID-19 crisis has magnified these trends, just as it has been a stress test for international cooperation and solidarity. Mr. President, saving lives from terrorism, like saving lives from viral diseases, requires reinvigorated and inclusive multilateralism, as called for by the Secretary-General Guterres. The Security Council's leadership remains critical to ensure a united front against terrorism that is anchored in the United Nations Charter and international law, with human rights and gender equality at its heart. I would like to raise three fundamental points as you reflect on a multilateral way forward to effectively prevent and defeat terrorism. First, international solidarity is even more imperative in our independent world, including through practical collaboration and impactful capacity building. Law enforcement and criminal justice responses, as mandated by this Council, are indispensable to detect, deter, and bring terrorists to justice. They are also increasingly complex and resource intensive. Even better equipped states are challenged to keep pace with evolving and emerging threats both offline and online. We must therefore urgently bolster international counter-terrorism cooperation. Second, we need a renewed commitment to look beyond terrorism as a tactic and address the underlying conditions and drivers that enable it to sustain and spread. A strategic investment in building resilience is necessary to effectively counter violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Your voice is critical to emphasize that preventing and countering terrorism is necessary to facilitate decisive progress on the interlinked peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights agendas. Third, engaging more and better with youth, civil society, the private sector, and the scientific community in the fight against terrorism is key to be responsive to the social and technological realities of the 21st century. Public-private partnerships are a critical tool to effectively address terrorism. Mr. President, since 2001, the Security Council has built upon Resolution 1373 to develop a comprehensive set of measures and guidance for member states to prevent and counter terrorism, taking on new issues and strengthening attention to international human rights, humanitarian and refugee law. Concurrently, supporting member states' efforts to implement these requirements has grown as a matter of priority for the United Nations system, guided also by the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy since 2006. Today, we are more coherent and coordinated than ever in providing this support, thanks to the reform of the counter-terrorism architecture initiated by the Secretary-General Guterres in 2017. The close collaboration between my office and the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate is at the heart of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact, which brings together 43 UN and non-UN entities. We have made steady progress through this partnership in line with Resolution 2395, ensuring that our capacity building support builds on the assessments conducted by CITED and the recommendations adopted by the Counter-Terrorism Committee. Our flagship programs on countering terrorist travel, countering terrorism financing, and on prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration are a few concrete examples of this approach. We will continue working to consolidate and expand the gains from these reforms, further integrating and sharpening our assistance. Mr. President, as we mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and Security Council Resolution 1373, and the 15th anniversary of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, the time could not be more relevant for this Council and all member states to reaffirm the imperative of multilateral action against terrorism. It's essential to reinvigorate international counter-terrorism cooperation during and after the pandemic, with a focus on emerging threats and challenges. We need an inclusive approach and a strategic investment in building resilience. The United Nations, working through the Global Counter-Terrorism Coordination Compact, stands ready to continue supporting member states in these efforts and look forward to your guidance. I thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Voronkov, for this briefing. I give the floor to Ms. Michelle Conins. You have the floor, madam. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's to address you at today's event marking the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1373. The adoption of the resolution in the wake of the terrorist attacks of the 11th of September 2001 against the United States was the seminal moment at which the Council and international community acknowledged the severity of the threat posed by transnational terrorism. Over the subsequent 2 decades, the United Nations has been at the center of the multilateral efforts to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. We must continue to remember and honor all victims and survivors of terrorism, promote their rights and needs, and provide them with avenues for healing through justice and support in order to ensure that they attain truth, justice, and dignity. In adopting Resolution 1373, the Council also established the Counter-Terrorism Committee to monitor, promote, and facilitate states' implementation of its provisions. The Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate, or CTAD, was established by the Council in its Resolution 1535 as a special political mission to assist the committee in its work. And CTAD's mandate includes the following main elements: assessing the implementation of counterterrorism measures by member states and recommending ways to address identified implementation gaps, facilitating the delivery of technical assistance and expertise to states as needed with a view to strengthening their counterterrorism capacities, analyzing counterterrorism trends and developments at the national and global levels, as well as promoting effective practices to address new and emerging challenges. CTAD's unique mandate is underpinned by a human rights compliant and gender sensitive framework. Within the framework of our ongoing dialogue with member states, we also work to enhance international cooperation in countering terrorism. Our numerous partners, including UNOCT and other UN entities, international and regional organizations, civil society and the private sector, inform our facilitation of technical assistance delivery, as well as our understanding of trends and developments. Close engagement with the member entities of our global research network enables us to incorporate the latest evidence-based research into our work and publications. Since CTAD's establishment, its mandate has been further expanded and developed by more than 20 further Security Council resolutions. As we look back over the past 2 decades, we see evidence of considerable evolution in the terrorist threat. We have witnessed the dramatic rise of ISIL, or also known as Daesh, and its subsequent defeat as a territory holding entity. But we remain aware that ISIL's destructive legacy will continue to pose challenges as we continue to seek truth and justice for its victims and survivors, and address the situation of thousands of ISIL-associated foreign terrorist fighters and their family members. In recent years, ISIL affiliates have emerged, including in South Asia, Southeast Asia, the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, and Southern and Eastern Africa. The proliferation of extreme right-wing or racially and ethnically motivated terrorism is also a cause of increasing concern. And countering the use of internet and other virtual platforms by terrorist groups for recruitment, financing, and planning purposes will also remain a priority, as will continued efforts to counter terrorism financing. As emphasized in 2 recent CTAD analytical reports, the COVID-19 pandemic has further complicated an already challenging threat landscape. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as we continue to address existing and emerging challenges, we must also reflect on lessons learned and areas where we can further strengthen our responses. Some states have introduced overly broad domestic counterterrorism legislation, leading to overreach by state authorities, human rights violations, and suppression of dissent. We must ensure that future counterterrorism policies respect the rule of law and are both human rights compliant and gender sensitive. States should also engage all sections of society, including religious, community and women leaders, educators, youth and social workers in their development of counterterrorism strategies that are comprehensive and integrated. They must also ensure effective implementation of their respective national plans and seek to address underlying grievances, including by focusing on the inclusion of vulnerable communities. Despite the many challenges that it faces, the international community has made significant progress in its efforts to counter and prevent terrorism. CTAD has gathered a considerable amount of information from member states about their implementation endeavors, including their progress, their strengths, shortfalls, and needs. their capacity to provide assistance to other states in need, and useful experiences to be shared with other states. The Council and the Committee have continued to promote multilateralism and international cooperation as a means to strengthen national level institutional capacity. We must continue to pursue a comprehensive, coordinated, one UN approach aimed at assisting states to develop and implement effective counterterrorism measures while also addressing conditions conducive to terrorism and violent extremism. CTAT will continue to assist the committee in its efforts to fulfill the mandates as set forward in the relevant Council resolutions and to work closely with states in their implementation efforts, including by promoting the sharing of best practices and lessons learned over the past 20 years since the adoption of Resolution 1373. I do thank you.
على هذه المداخلة القيمة وأعطي.
Thank you for this informative briefing. I give the floor now to Ms. Fatima Akilu. You have the floor, Madam.
Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your invitation to address this especially important meeting on the 20th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1373, which led to the establishment of counterterrorism infrastructure within the United Nations to give a civil society perspective. I would also like to congratulate Tunisia on its leadership. For the best part of a decade, I've been involved in counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, first as part of government and now as part of civil society. This has given me perhaps a unique vantage point to survey the landscape which we now find ourselves in. In 2015, having set up a complementary soft approach to Nigeria's counter-terrorism infrastructure, which included our very first radicalization program, a counter-radicalization program focusing on peace studies, values, critical thinking, as well as setting up the first network between Nigeria's security sector and civil society called PAVE, I left government to join civil society. In 2016, I set up the NEEM Foundation, and here we designed and implemented several programs. This included a comprehensive reintegration program for people coming out of the Boko Haram insurgency, a trauma-based program to address the psychological impact of the insurgency, early warning mechanisms to spot signs of radicalization, as well as reintegration program for defectors. When implementing this, we realized that we would need a generational capacity in multiple fields to counter terrorism. This would range from psychology, research to criminal justice, peace studies, to name but a few. However, to truly combat terrorism, we need both member states and civil society to come together in a spirit of cooperation. Working in government, I was acutely aware of the gaps that only a robust civil society partnership could fill. Similarly now, as a member of civil society, each day I'm much more aware of the limitations that I face. While the United Nations recognizes the importance of partnering with civil society organizations and its impact on advancing mutual goals, this approach has not always been applied consistently by all member states. When member states and civil society come together, we have the very best chance of combating terrorism in the long term. I would like to briefly give 4 examples of such partnerships that I have been involved in. The first is my organization working with multiple civil society organizations has teamed up with a multinational joint task force, which is a military outfit supporting 4 countries in the Lake Chad Basin, as well as the Lake Chad Basin Commission, which is the political leadership of the 4 countries, to devise a strategic action plan with a robust communication strategy to counter Boko Haram. This was, we came together on the premise that countering terrorism is a shared responsibility between civil society, military, as well as member states. The second is an initiative by the AU and the Lake Chad Basin Commission, which is planning a regional and stabilization, recovery and resilience, which focuses on screening, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of terrorist suspects. As a result of this greater harmonization with civil society, organizations such as mine can now work with governments in designated rehabilitation and reintegration centers. My organization, NEEM, has been doing psychological testing and risk assessments on behalf of the military for the that they had before. The third is, again, the Lake Chad Basin Commission has partnered with the UNDP, the very first regional civil society platform, to work with all member states of the region. This is to come out collectively with comprehensive rehabilitation and reintegration plans. These will then be implemented with direct support from member states and provide an opportunity for joint learning between government and civil society, and also the documentation of best practice. And the fourth area that I'd like to mention is that women and girls have been disproportionately affected by insurgency and conflict. They've been subjected to gender-based violence, both at the hands of the insurgents, but also within their communities, and some at the hands of caregivers, including security service members within their communities. These women also face a large reduced access to health services, including reproductive health. For a lot of these women, especially in rural or poor urban centers, there are very few services. There's often an absence of governance, and the only services they receive is at the hands of civil society members. Governments can work with these organizations to identify these victims and ensure that their human rights are protected and that they have better access to expanded services could be made available for them. As a current member of civil society, I believe that we are a critical source of expertise, capacity building, local knowledge, and could be a veritable bridge to build trust between victims of terrorism and governments in our counter-terrorism efforts. We are in a unique position to advise governments while providing an evidence base for government policies based on the research that we're able to carry out. If invited, we can help build the capacity of states to prevent terrorism, especially in the areas of negotiation, rehabilitation, reintegration, services for women and girls, as well as adherence to human rights norms. In conclusion, we'd like to see a far more greater involvement between CTAD, governments, and civil society. Unless we're all able to come together to work in a holistic manner in an all-of-society approach, we will never be unable to fill the many gaps that exist in our counter-terrorism response. I thank you very much for the invitation, and I thank you for listening.
شكرا لك سيدة أكيد على هذه الإحاطة. نقدر من خلالك.
Very much. We very much appreciate the work that civil society does on an international level for the interest that they pay to this important issue, the fight against international terrorism and its threats to international peace and security. I now wish to make a statement in my capacity as the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Tunisia. At the outset, I wish to thank the Under-Secretary-General and head of the UNOCT, Mr. Voronkov, as well as Executive Director of CTED, Ms. Conins, for their very comprehensive briefings. I would also like to extend my thanks to Ms. Fatima Akilu, representative of civil society, for her excellent briefing too. We chose to hold this open debate on international cooperation in terms of counting international terrorism at the start of this year, which indeed coincides with the 20th year anniversary of the creation of the International Regime for Counter-Terrorism and the Resolution 1373, as well as the 20th anniversary of the creation of the Counter-Terrorism Committee. We wish that this session here provide us with opportunity to take stock of 2 decades of efforts and activities on an international level within the EU, within the UN also, and see what lessons we can learn. And this is hence why my country is so interested in this issue, one of regional, international and national priorities. It's also an opportunity to focus on the key importance of this resolution, which was a watershed moment as to how states approach the issue of terrorism. Tunisia and myself, we were honoured to participate in the drafting and adoption of this resolution. As we commemorate this anniversary, it's particularly symbolic. We are celebrating what the international community has done so far, which agreed on the concept of terrorism following lengthy negotiations. Because various bodies met constantly in order to agree on a concept to define this terrorism. And this connection, we'd recall the laudable efforts that were made by the members of the Security Council in 2001 when this resolution was adopted. And today it is now the international reference point for multilateral action for counter-terrorism and fighting terrorism in all its forms. We would like to thank the committee that was created under this resolution and which is chaired by the British Ambassador Jeremy Greenstock. This committee has made no small effort to define Resolution 1373 and define how the international community can implement it. This resolution reflects the common shared awareness raising of awareness of the international community of the threats posed by terrorism to international peace and security. This resolution was the first milestone in terms of international efforts to fight all forms of terrorism. It laid the foundation for the UN regime for counterterrorism through the creation of the Counter-Terrorism Committee. This committee, through its executive directorate, over the last 2 decades has been working to build states' capacity to fight this criminal phenomenon, which is both complex, international, and it also allowed to keep up with how terrorism changes over time. In the years that followed, we have following the revolution of dignity and freedom, we were sought to bring our legislation in line with the international legal framework for counterterrorism. This is also because we are concerned with respecting our international obligations too. Thus, we enacted a new law in 2015, which is in line with all international instruments and all Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism. And this has been done through executive measures, which are very clear, and also clear definitions of the crime of terrorism. Tunisia has also received support from the Executive Directorate to establish its first national counterterrorism strategy and want to fight violent extremism. This was in 2016. We also have various coalitions and mechanisms on a regional and international level to fight terrorism and also to exchange information, much like the International Coalition Against Daesh or even in the African Union. We have the Sahel country group and the Sahara, as well as the TSCP, which is the Trans-Sahara Coalition to Fight Terrorism. But despite all of these efforts at the UN and the international, regional and national levels, terrorism remains a danger around the world. Terrorist organizations still try to exploit the political and social economic repercussions of COVID-19 in order to step up their destructive activities and to spread their destructive thinking and discourse and reach even more vulnerable strata of society, particularly through new means of communication and through social networks. This is why military activities to fight terrorism have been excluded from Resolution 2532. This was adopted in July last by the Security Council following a Franco-Tunisia initiative for an immediate ceasefire and a humanitarian truce. In the light of this, we wish to present to this August Council the following ideas by way of contribution to international efforts in order to benefit from the lessons that we've learned and face emerging threats. Firstly, mobilizing human and financial resources on a national and international level to counter COVID-19 should not have repercussions on those resources that are dedicated to fighting terrorism. On the contrary, we must increase those resources too, so that the pandemic does not benefit terrorist groups. The fight against terrorism must always also remain a priority internationally and nationally despite the pandemic. Secondly, we should also adopt a global approach that is based on strengthening the preventive aspect of this and how we deal with the factors that strengthen violent extremism and terrorism. These include the peaceful resolution of disputes, including particularly those that have lasted for far too long. We must also support a culture of dialogue, of values and tolerance and moderation. We must also move forward with sustainable development and achieve gender equality and fight corruption, marginalization and exclusion. We should also strengthen the rule of law and human rights. Thirdly, we should clearly, in our political speeches and statements and also in practice, we should not link violent extremism and terrorism with any ethnic or religious identity, because this is not true, and it also strengthens the feeling of injustice and thus creates more of a breeding ground for terrorism. Fourthly, we must also recognize that governments cannot fight terrorist action and discourse on the internet and on social networks alone. For this, it is important also to create partnerships that are both effective and practicable with civil society, with the private sector, and on international, regional, and national levels too. Fifthly, we must make the fight against terrorism a national priority, and to do this, we must be able to mobilize all of society and all governmental department sectors, fully respecting human rights, to highlight that these terrorist organizations completely run counter to the values of society. We must also respond to the basic needs of our citizens in order to prevent terrorist groups from attracting new recruits. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate Tunisia's determination to pursue its efforts as a member of the Security Council and also as chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee. We are determined to strengthen our cooperation between CTED and UNOCT and all other UN bodies too, and particularly during this year, when we will be reviewing the global counterterrorism strategy, and we will also be renewing mandates of CTED. We are also going to pursue our active commitment to all of our joint action, whether this be bilateral or as part of the Counterterrorism Committee. The aim being to further support international efforts to fight terrorism and violent extremism. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
اسمي ميلادي ألف مهامي رئيس الجلسة.
I resume my function as President of the Security Council, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Simon Coveney, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence of Ireland.
Please, and first of all, I'd like to thank Minister Gerandi and the Tunisian presidency for convening this debate. Many thanks also to Under Secretary-General Voronkov and Executive Director Conins for their briefings today, and also, of course, to Fatima Akilu of the Neem Foundation. Mr. President, this is my first time to address the Council since Ireland assumed its seat on the 1st of January. And we take our responsibilities entrusted to us very seriously. And we want to be constructive and a thoughtful partner on this Security Council for the next 2 years. I look forward to working closely with you and with fellow Council members over the coming 2 years to support the Council in fulfilling our shared goal of promoting international peace and security. Ireland aligns itself with the statement submitted on behalf of the EU, and Ireland also supports the presidential statement, which has been adopted today. Terrorism remains one of the gravest threats to international peace and security. The UN Counter-Terrorism Committee was established 2 decades ago. Ireland was a Security Council member at the time, as was your country, Mr. President. Those weeks following the September 11th terrorist attacks, as we worked on Resolution 1373, were monumentous ones. Our work on that resolution and establishing the committee has certainly paid dividends in counter-terrorism and in the intervening 2 decades. Today, the UN counter-terrorism framework is wide and deep and encompasses resolutions on issues ranging from addressing the financing of terrorism to foreign terrorist fighters, with the Counter-Terrorism Committee at its core. But we've seen too many terrorist attacks in the years since the committee began its valuable work. Citizens are most often the victims of such attacks. Today, I want to express our deep sympathy and support for all victims of terrorism. I want to emphasize that this includes the victims of sexual and gender-based violence committed by terrorist groups. As a Council member, we will work so that this Council brings a new momentum to support the victims of terrorism and, of course, holding perpetrators to account. In resolving together to combat terrorism, we must use every opportunity to deliver on our commitment to international peace and security, a key priority for Ireland's UNSC term. From our own lived experience of conflict on the island of Ireland, we know that building peace is not easy, it's not quick, but it is possible, and the UN has a critical role to play. We must also work together to provide a stronger framework for multilateral cooperation, a forum for dialogue, support and engagement. Regional and international cooperation remains vital. Strengthening prevention is also a core priority for Ireland. We know that poverty and discrimination both contribute to terrorism, and indeed that they are exacerbated by terrorism. The UN is uniquely placed to bring coherent approaches to issues including poverty, inequality, and climate change, as well as work in supporting effective governance, including through capacity building. Those tasks are key to countering terrorism, as well as many others. The current pandemic has demonstrated how terrorists adapt to find new audiences and opportunities online to spread hate, to radicalize, and recruit new members, and of course, raise funds. We welcome the Counter-Terrorism Committee's efforts to assess the impact of the pandemic, including on areas where the terrorist threat has increased as a result of it. We urge the committee to complete its work with urgency and to support affected states in identifying and tackling terrorism. Addressing the evolving threat from politically motivated violent extremism and terrorism, especially the growing number of far-right attacks, is part of our responsibility too. Mr. President, in adapting to deal with new threats, we must not lose sight of our core values and principles. Ireland has consistently argued that measures to combat terrorism must comply with international law, including human rights law. human rights law and international refugee law as well. I say that because we know any other response will be ineffective and indeed at times counterproductive. Put simply, violations of human rights can contribute to radicalization and the growth of terrorism itself. Today, I want to emphasize that I see the engagement of women and young people as fundamental to combating terrorism. The full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in the creation and development of policy is critical to building resilience and to countering terrorism. We will champion work on the Council on Women, Peace and Security. It's also vital that we engage civil society and other stakeholders to prevent and counter violent extremism and terrorism. I'm aware of the best practices that are being followed by Tunisia in this regard and welcome the contribution of Fatima Akilu at this meeting. Sustained engagement by the Committee with civil society and other key stakeholders is essential to the success of our common mission to tackle terrorism, ensuring that counter-terrorism measures, including sanctions, do not have an unintended or negative impact on those who most need our support will remain a guiding objective for my country during our tenure. We will apply that particularly to the critical work of humanitarian and civil society actors. We support the UN Office of the Ombudsperson on promoting transparency to sanctions regimes. Mr. President, thank you for shining a light on this critical issue. We stand by your side. I salute what has been achieved by the Counter-Terrorism Committee over the past 2 decades, but leave you with the thought that as the threats posed by terrorism continue to evolve, so does fear and mistrust. All of that is deeply damaging to our aspiration for global peace. It divides and weakens our societies. So let's resolve today, guided by our core principles and values, that we all start 2021 looking forward, working closely and collaboratively on this Council and across the UN to counter the threat of terrorism and, importantly, to address the factors that are fueling that scourge. Thank you.
معالي الوزير على هذه الكلمة القيمة.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Coveney for his statement. Excellencies, once again, Excellency, allow me to congratulate you on joining the Security Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jaishankar, the Minister for External Affairs of India. You have the floor.
At the outset, I would like to thank Your Excellency, Foreign Minister of Tunisia, Mr. Othman Jarandi, for inviting me to address today's UNSC meeting. Let me congratulate the Tunisian delegation for organizing this important meeting on the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1373, a landmark resolution in the global fight against terrorism. We recognize Tunisia's contribution as the chair of the Counter-Terrorism Committee and commend its steering the UNSC discourse on this critical issue. I would also like to thank Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Under Secretary-General, UNOCT, Ms. Michelle Conins, Executive Director, CTED, and Ms. Fatima Akilu, Executive Director of the Neem Foundation, for the briefings. Resolution 1373, adopted in the wake of the 9/11 terror attacks, reminds us that terrorism continues to be the gravest threat to mankind. It not only grievously impacts human life, but attacks the very foundation of humanity. By adopting this resolution, the Council conveyed its unequivocal determination to address the menace of terrorism. India has always been at the forefront of global counter-terrorism efforts. In 1996, long before the adoption of Resolution 1373, India took the initiative to pilot the draft Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism with the objective of providing a comprehensive legal framework to combating terrorism. We have signed and ratified all the major conventions and protocols on terrorism adopted by the UN and are part of all major global initiatives in that regard. Resolution 1373 and the Counter-Terrorism Committee are indeed important pillars of the global architecture against terrorism. Other UN initiatives, including the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, play a notable part in augmenting capabilities of member states and extending technical and capacity building assistance. The UN sanctions regime has also been an effective tool in the fight against terrorism. Mr. President, in recent years, terrorist groups and lone wolf attackers have significantly enhanced their capabilities by gaining access to new and emerging technologies, including drones, virtual currencies, and encrypted communications. Social media networks have contributed to the radicalization and recruitment of youth. The COVID-19 pandemic has only aggravated the situation further. The relative isolation and extended disruption due to the lockdowns and the associated distress and economic uncertainty has made the world more susceptible to radicalizing narratives and extremist propaganda. Preventing terrorists from accessing financial resources is crucial to successfully countering the threat of terrorism. Over the years, terrorist groups have developed a diversified funding portfolio through a range of criminal activities, including extortion, kidnapping, money laundering, drug smuggling, and trafficking of natural resources, humans, and antiquities. Terrorist organizations have also begun to exploit the anonymity afforded by blockchain technology for fundraising and finances. Some states lack the legal and operational frameworks and technical expertise needed to detect, investigate, and prosecute terrorist financing cases. However, there are also other states that are clearly guilty of aiding and supporting terrorism and willfully providing financial assistance and safe havens. While we must enhance capacities of the former, the international community must collectively call out the latter and hold them accountable. For the UN system to credibly address the menace of terrorism and ensure effective action, I would like to propose 8 points that could, in a way, be an action plan. 1, we must all summon the political will to unhesitatingly combat terrorism. There must be no ifs and buts in this fight. Nor should we allow terrorism to be justified or terrorists glorified. All member states must fulfill their obligations enshrined in international counter-terrorism instruments and conventions. 2, we must not countenance double standards in this battle. Terrorists are terrorists. There is no good or bad distinction. Those who propagate this only have an agenda, and those who cover up for them are just as culpable. 3, accordingly, we must reform the working methods of the committees dealing with sanctions and counter-terrorism. Transparency, accountability, and effectiveness are the need of the day. The practice of placing blocks and holds on listing requests without any rhyme or reason must end. This only erodes our collective credibility. 4, we must firmly discourage exclusivist thinking that divides the world and harms our social fabric. Such approaches facilitate radicalization and recruitment by breeding fear, mistrust, and hatred among different communities. The Council should be on guard against new terminologies and false priorities that can dilute our focus. 5, enlisting and delisting individuals and entities under the UN sanctions regime must be done objectively, not for political or religious considerations. Proposals in this regard merit due examination before circulation. 6. Linkages between terrorism and transnational organized crime must be fully recognized and addressed vigorously. We, in India, have seen the crime syndicate responsible for the 1993 Mumbai bomb blast not just given state protection, but actually enjoying 5-star hospitality. 7. Combating terrorist financing will only be as effective as the weakest jurisdiction. The Financial Action Task Force, FATF, should continue to identify and remedy weaknesses in anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing frameworks. Enhanced UN coordination with FATF can make a big difference. And 8, adequate funding to UN counter-terrorism bodies from UN regular budget requires immediate attention. The forthcoming 7th review of the UN's Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy offers an important occasion to strengthen measures to prevent and combat terrorism and build capacities of member states. Mr. President, I sincerely hope that these 8 suggestions merit serious consideration by the Council. While India has been itself battling terrorism for many decades with great resolve, these proposals have been framed with the interests of the entire international community in mind. It is time that all nations walk the talk against terrorism and commit themselves to the goal of zero tolerance. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency, Dr. Jaishankar, for his statement and proposals. I would like to congratulate you and congratulate India on becoming a member of the Security Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Rachel Omamo, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Kenya. You have the floor, ma'am.
The delegation of Kenya wishes to thank the delegation of Tunisia I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, okay, yes, we hear you.
Yes, there was some interference there. May I start again and say this, that I wish to commend the delegation of Tunisia for its insightfulness in convening this very important meeting during your presidency of the United Nations Security Council. I extend to you, my dear colleague, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia, my warmest greetings and state how delighted I am to be able to address the Council for the first time. Mr. President, I want to also thank Mr. Vladimir Voronkov and Ms. Michelle Conins and Fatima Akilu, I hope I pronounced your names correctly, for your very informative briefings and for the valuable work you've done to prepare for this meeting. Mr. President, terrorism in all its forms remains the leading challenge to the global order and human security on every continent. Kenya stands in solidarity with all countries, all communities, and all families that have been attacked by terrorists. This meeting comes at a time when the jihadist terrorist threat in Africa is acute. ISIS is regrouping and seeking safe havens in Africa's conflict zones. Additionally, Al-Qaeda has dedicated affiliates and an extensive transnational network in Africa. The recent horrific attack in Niger illustrates this. The existential threat of terrorism in Africa is rapidly evolving. Terrorism exacerbates state fragility and increases the vulnerability of communities because terrorism conflates with other pervasive challenges such as poverty, climate change, youth unemployment, forced migration, arms trafficking, as well as the growing cyber and transnational organized crime and the devastating economic and social ramifications of COVID-19. This toxic cocktail of insecurity not only threatens global peace and stability, but can potentially reverse the hard-won development gains made on the continent to the detriment of our people. Mr. President, in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, a declared and compliant affiliate of Al-Qaeda, remains a grave threat, not only within that country and the Horn of Africa region, but also beyond the African continent. For instance, this past December 16th, a New York court indicted an Al-Shabaab operative for conspiring to conduct an egregious attack in the United States. This indictment is a potent reminder to states that Al-Qaeda's affiliates remain threats to global peace and security, and they should be met with the full force of Resolution 1373 and associated instruments such as Resolution 1267. The surge in terrorism this last decade is testament to what happens when we, as members of the Security Council, underestimate the ambitions of terrorists. This is why Kenya supports the full utilization of sanctions against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates wherever they are found. As a frontline state in the global war against terrorist groups, Kenya is taking decisive action. The government last September froze the assets of 9 individuals associated with financing Al-Shabaab operations. This was our latest endeavor in the implementation of every measure called for in Resolution 1373. We continue to strengthen our compliance with Resolution 1373 by including its operative elements in our national counter-terrorism strategy. Kenya believes that the implementation of Resolution 1373 is a minimum requirement to be a member of the international community in good standing. We urge all states, particularly those who have Al-Qaeda or ISIS affiliates or splinter groups based in their territories, to prioritize implementing Resolution 1373. We also urge the Counter-Terrorism Committee to take stringent action to ensure that countries that have terrorist groups operating out of their territories are in compliance with Resolution 1373. These measures should include the Counter-Terrorism Committee's Executive Directorate and the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism closely monitoring progress and assisting in capacity building. In this regard, Kenya commends the UNOCT for establishing a program in Nairobi to serve as a regional hub to enhance counterterrorism and terrorism prevention through capacity building and information sharing. Excellencies, as I close, I urge all of us to honestly acknowledge that global consensus against terrorism is not as strong today as it was during the issuing of Resolution 1373, and that this places Africa at great risk. Counterterrorism is increasingly held hostage to geopolitics, even as citizens in many countries are subjected to brutal attacks. The terrorists, particularly those affiliated to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, seem to be encouraged by our flagging unity. Let us use this anniversary then to close ranks for the sake of our citizens, our economies, and global peace and security. We can start by taking tough, united measures that reflect the spirit and letter of Resolution 1373 against terrorist groups. We should surge capacity building worldwide, particularly in frontline states in Africa. We must aggressively tackle the kinetic threat of terrorist groups while also ensuring that they do not permeate and dislocate the social fabric of our societies through radicalization and recruitment of a new generation of militants, particularly through the exploitation of opportunities availed by technology and the internet. Indeed, the challenge of cyber-driven radicalization should be a matter of great concern to the Counter-Terrorism Committee. I conclude by affirming Kenya's resolve to do its utmost in concert with other members of the Security Council to combat the threat of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. And I thank you for your kind attention.
شكرا لك يا سيدة الوزيرة.
Your Excellency, for this valuable intervention. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Monica Mæland, Minister of Justice and Public Security of Norway. You have the floor, Your Excellency.
Thank you so much. I would like to start to thank His Excellency Minister Othmar Girondi for convening this important meeting and for including a civil society briefer. Their perspectives and experience provide a valuable contribution to our work. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary-General Michelle Conins, Under Secretary-General Voronkov, and also Ms. Fatima Akilu for their insightful interventions. President, when Norway last sat on this council 20 years ago, we also took part in the establishment of the Counter-Terrorism Committee through the adoption of Resolution 1373 in 2001. We are proud to now continue this work. We commend the CTC for efforts made since its establishment. Together with CTED, the CTC has made a significant contribution to the global efforts against international terrorism. President, many lessons have been learned since the establishment of CTC, but we would like to take this opportunity to express our support to the 3 suggested further steps that could be taken to strengthen our work going forward. First, implementation of measures under Secretary Council resolutions have been effective. But as seated country assessments have shown, several countries are still in need of technical and infrastructural support in order to fully comply. More effort and better coordination is needed to ensure this support is provided. Second, the committee must work and coordinate closely with the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism as well as the subsidiary organs of the Council, especially the 1267 and 1540 committees. This is essential for the implementation of a one UN approach. And third, the whole counter-terrorism architecture must make sure to include and coordinate together also on cross-cutting issues. President, taking a broader perspective on today's topic, there can be no doubt that violent extremism and terrorism pose a threat to global peace and security. We too feel that threat. Like too many other countries, Norway has also experienced terrorist attacks. This year makes 10 years since the 22nd July attacks, when a right-wing extremist took the lives of 77 people in Norway, most of them young people. And in 2019, a young man attacked a mosque aiming to frighten and kill Muslims. These experiences had a significant impact on Norway as a nation. Still, it is difficult for us to comprehend what it must be like for countries and societies who face terrorism on a regular basis. There can be no greater driving force for us to combat this threat together. Colleagues, Norway advances a counter-terrorism policy focusing on prevention and encompasses a whole-of-society approach. Women, young people, civil society, local communities, and governments all play important roles in preventing terrorism. In order to fight the root causes of terrorism globally, it is essential to combat poverty and marginalization, as well as to support critical thinking and education. Evidence also shows that empowered women help create peaceful and stable communities, which in turn lead to better prevention of violent extremism. We cannot overemphasize the importance of a human rights-based approach. All aspects of states' national security practice must comply with international law and uphold human rights, even when dealing with most serious crime. We are deeply concerned about the increasing global misuse of counter-terrorism measures to silence human rights defenders, political opponents, and religious and ethnic minorities. Counter-terrorism measures also must not prevent legitimate and principled humanitarian action. There is no contradiction between effective counter-terrorism efforts and humanitarian response. President, in the fight against terrorism, we must consider potential further trends. Seated strengths reports and country assessments are essential in this regard. A recent policy brief by UNDP also includes scenarios where the impacts of climate change has aggravated the root causes of violent extremism. We need to be aware of what could happen in the future and focus not only on preparedness but on prevention. In the Sahel, we have seen growing linkages between terrorism, organized crime, and intercommunal violence. Terror groups exploit inter-ethnic tensions and the absence of the states in some areas to advance their agenda. President, looking at other trends, we see that conspiracy theories and extremist ideas continue to be easily shared online. We have seen how the internet can accelerate radicalization, and we know that extremists are also exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic to expand these activities and networks. We note with concern the continued mentioning of the 2011 terrorist attack in Norway in online forums. Sadly, it also has been a motivation for terrorist actors in other countries, including the attack in Christchurch. Additionally, terrorist networks continue to depend on external financing to run their organizations. This financing must be cut off. We must disrupt the links between organized crime and terrorism. Norway supports the work of the Financial Action Task Force to prevent the misuse of virtual assets for money laundering and terrorist financing. President, by tackling these issues and other outlined by colleagues today, we will continue to see progress on the global efforts against terrorism. In this and in closing, Norway emphasizes our firm view that in order to successfully combat terrorism in all its manifestations, we also need to take a preventive, integrated approach to counter-terrorism. Thank you so much.
معالي السيدة على ثانيا مجددا إمام النرويج ولي قاطبا كلمة إلى معالي السيد أكيلو.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Estonia commends Under Secretary Voronkov and Executive Director and Ms. Fatima Akilu for their statements and, of course, for their outstanding work. Let me thank Tunisia for organizing today's debate that commemorates the 20th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1373 and the establishment of the Counter-Terrorism Committee. In light of the constantly evolving nature of the threat, we must continue to work together to adjust the tools required to overcome the phenomenon of terrorism, be it misuse of internet for the terrorist purposes, strengthening the countering of terrorism financing, or working together to overcome the challenges posed by foreign terrorist fighters. Estonia acknowledges the United Nations' central role in leading the global effort to prevent and counter terrorism, in setting the standards with relevant Security Council resolutions and monitoring the member states to implement them. We commend the work of the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee, and Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, and encourage for stronger coordination in building expertise, identifying the needs on the ground, and assisting member states. Furthermore, it's important that all UN agencies continue to build their efforts on engaging more with the different civil society groups and actors, youth, women, private sector, communities, religious leaders, human rights defenders, and victims of terrorism to be successful in designing counter-terrorism policies and tools. Estonia appreciates the increasing cooperation that the United Nations has with the European Union, Europol, Eurojust. The European Union is one of the major contributors to the OCT. I would like to underline the UN-EU counter-terrorism partnership in Sudan and joint projects aimed at preventing acts of nuclear terrorism and expanding the dialogue with CTED. Mr. President, Estonia condemns terrorism and violent radicalization in all its forms and manifestations. Terrorism is a global threat, and therefore Estonia has actively contributed to tackling that on the international forum for years, and we are committed to continue that in the future. We are facing new complex security challenges, like cyber threats, hybrid threats, and capabilities, like drones that increase the real threat from terrorists to civilian population, and our men and women on operations and missions across the world. My country is convinced that fight against terrorism can be successful only if we focus on the following principles. First, states must ensure that all counterterrorism measures comply with their obligations under international law, in particular international human rights law, refugee law, humanitarian law. Ignoring these principles can undermine counterterrorism activities and lead to increased radicalization fed by violence and the sense of impunity. Therefore, we also condemn all attempts of misusing counterterrorism agenda as a pretext for human rights violations. Secondly, we need a comprehensive approach to address the root causes of terrorism, improving socio-economic situation, ensuring access to public services, in particular in the field of education and healthcare, reduces the space for violent extremist groups to act. This is more important than ever as we face economic decline caused by COVID-19. Estonia gives its share to address the causes of instability, to reduce poverty and marginalization of certain groups, and promote gender equality. For example, supporting Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey through increasing their IT and entrepreneurial skills and offering psychological support. Thirdly, to tackle terrorism, we have been able to disrupt the immediate threat of direct attacks, break up terrorist networks, and be technologically ahead of their capabilities. Estonia continues to contribute to many multilateral counter-terrorism operations in different regions in the world. Our troops are in Mali, they are in Afghanistan, and in the Middle East, where terrorist threat is unfortunately the highest in the world. Fourthly, the question of accountability and denying impunity to the perpetrators of crimes against civilians is an essential part of preventing and countering terrorism. It is also a vital part of a comprehensive approach to restoring trust and creating conditions for sustainable peace. Respecting human rights, promoting inclusion and comprehensive action, fighting with impunity are all key factors in making our societies more cohesive and preventing success of ideologies which preach violence. As we look ahead towards the next 20 years, we should turn our collective efforts towards these principles instead of only dealing with the consequences. And finally, let us honor the women and men in the field who stand in the front lines of fighting terrorism, sometimes at the cost of their lives. Members of the armed forces, law enforcement, social and humanitarian workers, community and religious leaders. Their dedication makes a big difference. Thank you, Mr. President.
شكرا.
Thank you, Your Excellency Luke, for this important statement. I give the floor now to His Excellency Mr. James Cleverly, Minister of State for the Middle East and North Africa of the United Kingdom and North Ireland. You have the floor now.
President, I would like to thank you for hosting this important debate today, and also Under Secretary-General Voronkov, Executive Director Conins, and also Ms. Fatima Akilu for their informative and important briefings. It's been 20 years since the Security Council established the Counter-Terrorism Committee. Our work has strengthened the cooperation we need to protect our citizens and counter the scourge of terrorism. Subsequent Security Council resolutions have built an effective toolkit for guidance and measures for states to respond to the evolving threat. They now cover everything from international legal cooperation to counterterrorism financing, from specific challenges like aviation security to broad issues like human rights, gender, and civil society. With the support of the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, the committee has helped assess states' implementation of the resolutions and identified emerging challenges, examples of best practice, and opportunities for technical assistance. Of course, the Council and the committee have not been acting alone. In 2014, the Global Coalition Against Daesh brought together 83 partners, including the United Kingdom, to combat Daesh and liberate 8 million people from its control. Organisations such as the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum, of which the UK is a founding member, have bolstered international cooperation. Other parts of the UN system, most importantly, the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism, have also played an important role. Through this work and through the leadership of the United Nations Security Council, we have built a shared understanding of the terrorism threat and developed the tools to counter it. Mr. President, as a result of our collected efforts, Al-Qaeda has been degraded, and Daesh was defeated on the battlefields of Iraq and Syria. But, sadly, the threat has evolved and remains with us. Terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda and Daesh affiliates, continue to operate around the world. Terrorist narratives continue to radicalize individuals in diffuse and unpredictable ways. New threats from extreme right-wing groups have increased. So, the work of the Council and of this committee remains vital. Looking forward, I want to stress 4 key priorities. Firstly, the Council should continue to learn and adapt to the latest threats and emerging trends. I mentioned extremist right-wing groups. Terrorist misuse of social media and other new technologies need greater attention. We also need to tune in to how longer-term effects of COVID-19 might influence the terrorism dynamic. Secondly, the Council should reaffirm states' obligations under international law to protect and promote human rights whilst countering terrorism. The threats posed by terrorism do sometimes require states to take extraordinary measures. However, too often, counter-terrorism is used to justify egregious human rights violations and oppressions. States must act within the boundaries of international law. Otherwise, we undermine the very rights and freedoms that the UN was established to promote. While it is not the only instance around the world, a case in point is the situation in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur and other ethnic minority communities face severe and disproportionate measures, with up to 1.8 million people having been detained without trial. These well-documented measures are inconsistent with China's obligations under international humanitarian rights law, including the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. They run counter to the Security Council's long-standing requirement that counter-terrorism measures comply with states' obligations under international law, including international human rights law. Third, the Council should reaffirm the importance of inclusion and partnership. Effective counter-terrorism requires more than the cooperation of governments. It requires whole societies. This means promoting the leadership of women, young people, and minorities, building effective partnerships with the private sector, with religious leaders, and ensuring we listen to all the voices of our peoples. And fourth, the Council should push for coherence within the UN system. We welcome the existing close cooperation between Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate and the UN Office for Counter-Terrorism, as well as the Al-Qaeda and Daesh monitoring team and other UN agencies. It remains vital that this continues, especially in the area of capacity building, so that resources are deployed effectively and where they have the greatest impact. Mr. President, as the terrorist threat endures and evolves, so too must our resolve to fight it remain firm. The Security Council's counterterrorism architecture has been an integral part of that fight over the last 20 years, and the United Kingdom will work to ensure it remains relevant, efficient, and effective in the years ahead. Thank you.
And وأعطي الآن الكلمة إلى معالي السيدة كيسل بيترز وزيرة الدولة.
I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Kessel Peters, Minister of State with responsibility for Foreign Affairs of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's ministerial open debate on the important issue of countering terrorism and violent extremism. I would also like to thank Under Secretary-General for Counter-Terrorism, Vladimir Voronkov, and CTED Executive Director, Michelle Conins, and Executive Director of Neem Foundation, Fatima Akilu, for their invaluable informative briefings. 2 decades ago, the Security Council's adoption of Resolution 1373 directed all states to take a range of measures against terrorism. Today, terrorism and violent extremism in all their forms and manifestations continue to threaten international peace and security. The recent attacks on 2nd January 2020 that claimed over 100 lives in Niger serves as a painful reminder of the devastating impact of terrorism. Today, I will focus my remarks on the approach needed to combat violent extremism and terrorism, the importance of our responsible cooperation as member states to this end, and the crucial role of the existing counter-terrorism framework. First, to successfully mitigate the threat of terrorism, we must look far beyond the domain of military strategy. While offensive operations can be at times required to protect civilian populations, long-term developmental solutions that enhance the capacities of states to address poverty, social inequality, political exclusion, and radicalization provide the surest pathway to promote stability and to counter terrorism. As we highlighted at last week's open debate on maintaining peace and security in fragile contexts, greater efforts are needed to address the root causes of fragility, which leaves states and their populations vulnerable to a range of security threats, including terrorism. All states have a duty to take sensible actions to combat terrorism and violent extremism. Irresponsible arms sales, persistent conflicts fueled by geopolitical rivalries, and other counterproductive actions should be avoided by all member states. Selective condemnation of terrorist attacks, depending on which side of the border they are committed or by whom, only undermines our collective efforts to address this scourge. In addition, we must all ensure that any measures taken to combat terrorism comply with obligations under international law, in particular, international human rights, refugee, and humanitarian law. Further initiatives to combat financing of terrorism must be designed in such a way that they bolster rather than undermine legitimate socioeconomic activity. Today, as countries work to counter terrorism, the COVID-19 pandemic presents additional challenges. In this context, we welcome the measures adopted by the Counter-Terrorism Committee, the CTC, to continue the implementation of its mandates. Equally, strong coordination and collaboration between the committee, CTED, and UNOCT must continue, and we encourage the committee to enhance collaboration, information sharing, coordination with member states. Indeed, international, regional, and sub-regional cooperation remains vital in combating terrorism and bringing terrorists to justice. The UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy is a useful tool to further this cooperation between states. Building capacity and enabling technical cooperation between all countries to counter the terrorist threat must be a top priority of the international community. In conclusion, Mr. President, I would like to welcome the adoption of the presidential statement as an outcome of our deliberation today. Not only does the presidential statement provide an important basis for reinforcing the Council's engagement on countering terrorism, but it also builds on the Council's consistent, unequivocal, and strong condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. St. Vincent and the Grenadines joins all other responsible states in condemning this scourge, and we reaffirm our commitment to fight against terrorism and violent extremism. Mr. President, I thank you.
شكرا لك معالي السيدة بيترز.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Ms. Peters, for your statement. I now give the floor to those members of the Security Council. Beginning with the representative of the United States. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, and thank you to the Tunisian delegation for organizing this important meeting. I also want to thank our three briefers for their useful and insightful presentations, especially Executive Director Akilu, whose comments on the relationship between civil society and government in countering terrorism were very interesting and very important. I also just want to say how much I've gained, and my delegation appreciates the comments, the recommendations, the actions that have been recommended by the colleagues that have spoken before us. And these principles and actions and recommendations will certainly inform my delegation's work with all of you in the coming months and years on this issue. Finally, it's hard to believe it's been 20 years since the horrific events of 9/11, but I just want to begin by remembering the innocent lives lost that day, all victims of terrorism, as well as remember with gratitude the heroic actions of the first responders who saved so many lives on 9/11. As we have all heard, in the aftermath of that horrific day, the United States penned Resolution 1373, and this Council swiftly united to adopt this pivotal resolution to prevent such devastating attacks and help the international community fight terrorism globally. Our view is that the resolution has been successful. It drove all member states to adequately criminalize terrorism, and it provided a useful roadmap for building the needed national, regional, and international capabilities to counter terrorism. Weaknesses in all of our bureaucracies and all our security practices were brought to light. And all of the member states, including the United States, used that information to strengthen their counterterrorism infrastructures. We learned that we needed new tools to fight terrorism. And we learned the hard way that we needed to change the way our governments shared terrorist information internally and externally with our partners. I think most importantly, at the time, we committed to address this transnational threat together with whole of government, whole of society approaches, hand in hand with partner governments, civil society, international partners, private sector partners, and with the full and equal participation of women and youth. The Council, as we've heard, also established the Counter-Terrorism Committee, the CTC, to monitor and assist member states. Then in 2004, the Council created CTEC to support the committee and assist all UN member states to fully implement Resolution 1373 and other counterterrorism resolutions. Today, the US government's view is that those investments have paid off. CTID has been instrumental in this process. Its visits, its resulting reports from those visits, provide member states with a path to enhance their ability to implement the Council's resolutions, and we believe comprehensively prevent and counter terrorism and violent extremism. That is why the CTC must continue to play an important role in protecting CTID's independent reporting process and ensuring the Council's credibility is not eroded by politicized censorship. The Council and its CTC must further support CTED in its efforts to assist member states and to ensure no one is left behind. 20 years into this global fight, we've made tremendous progress, but there's still much to do. As many of my colleagues have just commented, the terrorism threat continues. It continues to morph and evolve, and we must adjust and redouble our efforts to prevent future attacks. While our coalition destroyed ISIS on the battlefield in Syria and Iraq, tens of thousands of foreign terrorist fighters and their families, including children, living in untenable conditions, remain in camps and have not been repatriated. The United States has repatriated a total of 28 Americans from Syria and Iraq, 12 adults and 16 children, with 6 of those adults now facing criminal charges. We believe repatriating foreign terrorist fighters to their countries of origin is the most reasonable solution to prevent them from returning to the battlefield. It is not only the right thing to do from a security standpoint, but also from a humanitarian standpoint. The current situation in these camps is untenable, and we believe we can all of us, do better. Let me also say, in response to comments from colleagues, the United States takes the threat from racially or ethnically motivated terrorist attacks very seriously, and we continue to take action to combat that particular form of terrorism. Last year, for the first time, the State Department designated a white supremacist group as a specially designated global terrorist. As colleagues have mentioned, history has also shown us over and over again that measures to prevent and counter terrorism that come at the expense of human rights and the rule of law are counterproductive. That is why the United States will continue to object to certain countries' actions to engage in mass detention of religious minorities and members of other minorities, engage in repressive surveillance and mass data collection, and to use coercive population control, like forced sterilization and abortion. Governments, including governments sadly represented in this council, must not use counterterrorism as a pretext for stifling freedom of religion or belief and other human rights and fundamental freedoms. Let me end by saying again, we thank Tunisia for your able chairmanship of the Counterterrorism Committee. We look forward to working closely with this council as we prepare for the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review and the CTED Mandate Review renewal later this year. We have made so much progress since the adoption of 1373, but much remains to be done, as we've heard, and we must continue adapting to keep our communities safe. Thank you, Mr. President.
لك سيدي على هذا البيان الهام وأعطي الكلمة الآن إلى مندوب مكسيكو.
Thank you for your statement. I give the floor to Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We are grateful to your delegation for convening this meeting as we mark the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1373. We are also grateful for the valuable information which was provided to us by the ASG Vladimir Voronkov, the Executive Director of the CTC, Michelle Conins, and we're particularly grateful to Ms. Fatima Akilu, who allowed us to hear the voice of civil society in this debate. The resolution referred to, that is Resolution 1373, together with the establishment of the CTC, set the standard for the development of what we now call counter-terrorism legislation. It is the decisions of this Council which, over time, have ultimately built up a body of legislation which is of the utmost importance in this field. Forging ahead with a legislative process to tackle a ever-evolving phenomenon which is not defined in a common fashion on the international level and which has various facets, brings with it multiple challenges, and there can be no doubt about this. Indeed, some of these challenges have been present for years, while others have emerged alongside new events on the ground. I'll settle here for simply outlining 5 such challenges, which have also provided areas in which we might harness opportunities for change. 1. I would state that it is vital that the fight against terrorism is conducted through legal channels, in strict compliance with international law. Human rights must not be undermined, and we must work on the basis of Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, which refers to the need to respect and enforce international humanitarian law. Recently, however, we have noted with concern that some measures adopted to combat terrorism hinder the provision of humanitarian assistance. The Council must ensure that when it adopts measures to hinder the financing of terrorism, it does not impede the work undertaken on the ground by humanitarian organizations. My second point would be that the fight against terrorism will not be won on the battlefields. Rather, it will depend on the success of preventive strategies designed to tackle the root causes of terrorism. Tackling these root causes involves prioritizing the reconstruction of our social fabric to avoid radicalization of our peoples. According to the most recent report released by CTED, more specifically the Emerging Trends report published last year, over the last 5 years, we've seen a 320% increase in attacks linked to persons affiliated to supremacist movements and far-right terrorist organizations. In light of that observation, we need a strategy which is preventive and tackles far-right terrorism. We need one which is effective, and indeed this must underpin international cooperation. It is vital that there is better oversight of the transfers of small arms and light weapons to implement the provisions of operative paragraphs 2A and 3A of Resolution 1373. Until we have stopped free access to firearms, we will continue to see cycles of violence continue and indeed be perpetrated. Our strategy to counter terrorism must be holistic and gender must be mainstreamed into it. This involves providing care to women and girls as victims of terrorism. It also involves harnessing their potential as forces for social change, and it also involves acknowledging that some new forms and notions of masculinity fuel the inclination to congregate in groups and to form pseudo-brotherly relations which underpin terrorist cells and supremacist ideologies. I would also say that the international community can make better use of the multilateral instruments and mechanisms available to it to tackle terrorism in all its forms and manifestations as an ever-changing transnational threat. We're also concerned by the frequent use of Article 51 of the UN Charter in the fight against terrorism. We reiterate that only full respect of the rule of law, both at a national and international level, will allow us to more effectively tackle this horrific scourge. Many thanks to you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Excellency, for your statement. I give the floor to France.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I would like to thank the Tunisian presidency for organising today's debate, and also like to thank the various speakers for their excellent briefings. Since the adoption of Resolution 1373, 20 years ago, the Security Council has continued to strengthen the normative framework for counter-terrorism. We must continue to do so and to rigorously implement and develop this framework that is so necessary while terrorists continue to kill, and France has suffered this several times. I would like to express our solidarity to all victims of terrorism. Justice must be served. The perpetrators of terrorist acts must be tried in the place closest to where they committed their crimes. I would like to make 4 points today. Firstly, the fight against terrorism can only be done with the support of civil society. I'd like to welcome the intervention from Ms. Fatima Akilu, and through her, women and young people and NGOs. I'd like to thank all of them. They have a vital role in combating the barbaric ideologies of terrorist groups. In zones of conflict, in Nigeria in particular, France continues to support, in partnership with UNICEF and with civil society, various projects that seek to protect children and to fight against the stigmatization of victims. Then, we must every day mobilize our efforts when we're faced with the threat of the use of the internet and social networks by terrorist groups. The current pandemic has only increased the influence of these tools. France has taken steps on a European level to achieve regulation on terrorism online, to prevent its appearance and to withdraw such posts within an hour. The effectiveness of these tools depends on them being implemented by everyone. In this connection, we'd call on states to join the Christchurch appeal launched by New Zealand and France with internet providers and civil society organizations. We need a common shared framework to regulate the content online. Thirdly, the fight against the financing for terrorism. This is a key aspect because you don't need much money to kill someone in the street, but you do need money to carry out a terrorist action. Resolution 2562, adopted by our council, was an important step, but we need to go further. Faced with the risk of the misuse of new technologies for terrorist purposes, particularly the growing use of cryptocurrencies. Well, certainly, the fight against the financing of terrorism should not be done to the detriment of military action, which must be maintained too. In this connection, we call on all states to join the humanitarian appeal, which was launched in 2019 by France and Germany. The UN must finally support a coordinated approach and provide capacity building for states faced with a terrorist threat, in particular in Africa. Peacekeeping operations have been adapted to the terrorist threat by increasing their information intelligence capacity. For example, MINUSMA supports the special judicial hubs to fight terrorism and transnational organized crime and prevention of violent extremism in prisons. So UN support must go beyond simply judiciary and security support. This is the aim for the Coalition for the Sahel. And we also welcome the appointment of a UN coordinator for development in the Sahel. I would like to conclude by recalling the importance for the respect of the rule of law, human rights, and international humanitarian law in the fight against terrorism. This is a vital imperative which must guide us in our global counterterrorism strategy, and when we review it in June. I thank you very much.
Monsieur l'ambassadeur, pour cette importante déclaration, et je donne tout de suite.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that important statement. And I now give the floor to the Russian Federation. Mr. President, first of all, allow me to thank you for the initiative of organizing this high-level meeting on the implementation of the Council's Counter-Terrorism Resolution 1373, which turns 20 this year. We are grateful to Tunisia for having prepared a balanced presidential statement, which once again confirms the relevance of the resolution and the Council's counter-terrorism measures that were developed on the basis of it. We welcome the head of the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism, Vladimir Voronkov, and the head of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, Executive Directorate, Michel Conins. Russia highly appreciates your contribution to the practical implementation of the decisions adopted by the Council and, of course, to today's discussion. We also welcome Ms. Fatima Akilu. Mr. President, the counter-terrorism priorities laid out in Resolution 1373 were built upon independently in subsequent Council decisions. As the terrorist threat changed, we steadily strengthened the mechanisms for the criminal prosecution of terrorists, for combating the financing of terrorism, and for combating the spread of violent propaganda. To this end, bilateral and multilateral channels of cooperation have been established and the exchange of information has been streamlined. Without question, the establishment of the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee and its Executive Directorate was a turning point. They were given responsibility for ensuring oversight of the implementation of relevant Council decisions. The monitoring and impartial evaluation of states remains the primary task of CTED experts. No other body in the UN system has nor could have the same mandate. The UN has established a contemporary counter-terrorism architecture, which is coordinated by the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism. Russia is in favor of the steady strengthening of cooperation between the OCT and CTED, with a focus on supporting the implementation of the Security Council's counter-terrorism decisions, including Resolution 1373. It's also important that technical assistance for interested states be provided on the basis of CTC recommendations, and it goes without saying, with the consent of the host country. At present, projects that are designed to strengthen border security, to combat foreign terrorist fighters, to stop terrorists using the internet, and to shut down the illicit supply of arms are particularly important. For its part, our country is supporting these efforts, including in financial terms. Mr. President, unfortunately, the threat of terrorism is not abating. It remains one of the major challenges of the modern age. And in responding to this challenge, joint efforts of the global community need to be deployed. Much greater efforts than those that are used to establish the relations between countries. Even during this pandemic that has encompassed the entire world, terrorists are continuing to try to take advantage of the situation. They accuse states of not being able to successfully deal with this crisis. The risk also remains that new hotbeds of instability will be created, chiefly due to the actions of FTFs who are returning to their countries of origin from combat zones. The implementation of Resolution 1373 is therefore just as relevant as it was 20 years ago. ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and related structures are inspiring attacks in countries that were until recently considered islands of security. The situation is compounded by the fact that those who commission or carry out terrorist attacks can be physically located on a different continent. And even given this level of uncertainty, there are still states that continue to neglect their obligations to prosecute terrorists and who refuse to cooperate with foreign partners. Sometimes this is done with reference to human rights. The use of this pretext in such an unscrupulous way is unacceptable. The effectiveness of the UN's work largely depends on whether its organs adhere to their mandates. At the moment, the Security Council and its subsidiary bodies sometimes pay too much attention to the human rights aspects of counterterrorism, which is the focus of other parts of the organization, and this to the detriment of their primary mission to ensure security. Mr. President, we are pleased to note Tunisia's contribution to the work of the CTC as its chair. 2021 promises to be a busy year in terms of activities that are directly related to Resolution 1373. We will have to update the tools for evaluating states, launch the new format of hybrid monitoring visits, and at the end of the year, renew the CTC's mandate. We hope that these efforts will result in a further improvement of the effectiveness of the UN's counter-terrorism efforts, including through the cooperation between states in good faith that is enshrined in Resolution 1373. Thank you.
Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation for this valuable intervention. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger. You have the floor, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank the Tunisian presidency for convening this debate on an important and timely issue, which is of urgent concern. I also wish to thank Mr. Vladimir Voronkov and Ms. Michelle Conins for their particularly comprehensive briefings. My thanks also extend to Dr. Fatima Akilu for sharing her perspective on this issue. Mr. President, terrorism constitutes a threat to peace and international security. And it is in light of that observation that the Security Council on the 28th of September 2001 adopted Resolution 1373 to provide the international community with the appropriate legal instruments to suppress through all legal means the financing and preparation of all terrorist acts on their territory. As a member state and eager to respect international law and uphold its international commitments, my country, Niger, has taken several measures to tackle terrorism, and we continue to cooperate with the responsible bodies of the United Nations, seated indeed is responsible for conducting missions to monitor the implementation by member states of Resolution 1373 and other resolutions. We cooperate, therefore, with seated. We welcomed the visit by seated to Niger recently. We cooperate with several UN bodies, and that has allowed my country to significantly improve its legal arsenal and its anti-terrorism strategy. Both are in line with international law. As part of this cooperation, Niger has benefited from a great deal of support in building the capacity of its law enforcement officials involved in counter-terrorism operations, namely border management, legal investigations into terrorism acts, and we've also benefited with cooperation in combating the nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism. We have received relevant recommendations from Security Council contained within 1373, and drawing on that resolution, we've ratified 14 counter-terrorism instruments, and we've transposed these instruments into our domestic legislation. We've also enacted provisions of further provisions of 1373. We have institutions responsible for doing monitoring work in the same way as the CDC does. We have a central service for the fight against terrorism. We have a bureau responsible for dealing with financial information. We also have a commission monitoring illicit weapons. We have a national commission combating the illicit trafficking of migrants, and we have the National Commission for Human Rights. Multilateral and bilateral cooperation is vital to effectively combat the terrorist scourge. I wish here to underscore the relevance of the cooperation agreement signed in Niamey recently between the government of Niger and the United Nations inquiry team responsible for tackling Daesh and holding them accountable for their acts. Moreover, I am delighted to inform you that very soon indeed, Niger will have a national strategy for the prevention of radicalization and violent extremism. The strategic fight against terrorism has already been lauded by an international organization which brought together national bodies and representatives of civil society. They all met recently. This strategy will also be in line with CTED recommendations issued when it visited Niger in 2018. Indeed, that was the visit to which I recently referred. Mr. President, 20 years after the adoption of Resolution 1373, there has been military success indeed in the fight against terrorist groups in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. But we still need to thwart the capacities of these terrorist groups, and indeed doing so poses an even greater challenge across the world, and more particularly in the Sahel. Proof of this is the recent attacks perpetrated in this area on the 2nd of January. These attacks claimed the lives of more than 100 civilians. Regarding the challenges that we must overcome, I wish to point to those pertaining to the fight against foreign terrorist fighters. Their numbers do not cease to increase in the Sahel, and they worsen the situation in Libya. We are collecting information to thwart terrorism, and we're noting that they're using terrorism to disseminate their hateful ideologies and for recruitment. There is, of course, a link between terrorism and transnational organized crime, and that's being harnessed by terrorism. They're harnessing the fragility sown by conflict. There is radicalization in prisons, and we need to facilitate the reintegration of former prisoners so that they don't fall prey to terrorism. Niger must draw upon the know-how of the relevant bodies of the United Nations and member states that are able to assist us, and that is crucial. Mr. President, to conclude, I wish to state that the transnational threat of terrorism means that states must unreservedly cooperate in the fight against terrorism in line with their obligations under the United Nations Charter. So that our fight is effective, it must encompass preventative measures, and it must involve us seeking to meet the basic needs of our people. I call for greater solidarity to be shown at an international level to support those states most affected by the scourge of terrorism, to stem terrorist financing, and to tackle the causes which foster the emergence of terrorist ideology and its take-up by many groups. We need to tackle corruption, extreme poverty, youth unemployment, and money laundering, because these are phenomena which lead to terrorism. Thank you. My thanks go to the delegate of Niger, and I now give the floor to Vietnam.
Mr. President, I would like to start by thanking Under Secretary-General Voronkov, Assistant Secretary Conins, and Ms. Akilu for their informative briefing. Since the unanimous adoption of the Resolution 1373, the United Nations Security Councils and international communities have implemented many important measures to combat these scourges. The counter-terrorism institutional framework has been strengthened through several resolutions and presidential statements by the Security Council on a wide range of topics such as financing of terrorism, judicial cooperations, foreign terrorist fighters, and protection of critical infrastructures against terrorist attacks. The CDC, with the assistance of its Executive Directorate, the monitoring teams, and the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism, in coordination with relevant agencies, have played an instrumental role in advancing international cooperation and building national capacity to combat terrorism. On the ground, ISO has suffered major defeat in its last controlled territory. However, the threat posed by international terrorism keep evolving and becoming more complicated. International terrorism had constantly maneuver, expand its network, and deploy more strategies and tactics. The risk of weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of terrorists remain high. This is a great concern over the trends of terrorists abusing information and communication technology to spread their propaganda and recruit new members, especially in the times of COVID-19. Inequality and other underlying drivers of violent extremism and terrorism, aggravated by the economic and political terms of pandemics, are likely to increase in the long term and at risk of exploitation by terrorists. Against this backdrop, it is essential to maintain our vigilance and strong unity in the fight against terrorism. My delegation stressed the importance of international and regional cooperations. As no country is safe until all is safe. It is particularly true when the state has to stretch their resources domestically to meet their priority. As a developing country, we see value in sharing of intelligence and analysis between and among state and international organizations about terrorist movement, imminent attacks, recruitment, financing, online propagandas, and new trends and developments. Of equal importance is the need to provide technical assistance to strengthen national and regional capacity to prevent and combat terrorism. In monitoring and facilitating the implementation of UNSC resolution, the CTC have made use of various tools such as country visit and detailed implementation assessment, which allow for constructive dialogue between the CTC and relevant agencies with the member state to identify achievements, challenges, and areas for further cooperation and technical assistance. We fully support the CTC through CTED to continue its assessment by resuming country visit and call on member states to support CTC's and CTED mandate. Cooperation between CEED and UNOCT, as well as between CTC and relevant committee in counter-terrorism and non-proliferations should be further strengthened. My delegation believes that a sustaining success in the fight against terrorism requires a holistic approach. The United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategies is a comprehensive and effective framework for our joint effort with the central coordinating role of the United Nations. Counter-terrorism measures must be undertaken in compliance with the UN Charter, including its principle of sovereignty, non-interference, political independence. We must heed the need to ensure unimpeded humanitarian assistance delivered by neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian agencies in accordance with relevant rules of international law. The Security Council must remain united and firmly committed to preventing and resolving conflict and sustaining peace. Comprehensive strategies to promote sustainable economic development, national reconciliations, building balance and cohesive society resilient to terrorism and radicalizations should be advanced. No effort should be spared in addressing the conditions conducive to terrorism in accordance with Pillar 1 of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategies. At the national level, it is critical to adopt a whole of society approach by involving all actors, especially women, young people, non-governmental organizations and private sector and academia. Mr. President, much has been achieved in advancing the cause of counter-terrorism. Unity has proved to be our greatest strength and effective response. My delegation reaffirmed our commitment to working closely with all partners in the global effort in fighting terrorism on the basis of United Nations Charter international law in the interest of peace, security for all countries. I thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for this important intervention, and I give the floor to His Excellency, the Ambassador of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China thanks Tunisia for the initiative of this open debate and is pleased to see Foreign Minister Othman Jerandi presiding over today's meeting. Under Secretary-General Voronkov and Executive Directors Conins offered many valuable insights in their briefings which merit our special attention and for which I express my appreciation. The 9/11 terrorist attacks that took place 20 years ago in this city shocked the world and turned a new page in the international counter-terrorism cooperation. In the aftermath of the attacks, the Security Council took swift action to adopt Resolution 1373 and mandated the establishment of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, putting on full display the joint will and determination of the international community to fight terrorism. For 20 years now, the CTC, with the assistance of CTED, has scrupulously played its role in monitoring the implementation of relevant Council resolutions on counterterrorism, including Resolution 1373, 1624, 2396, 2462, and 2482, and all the while has coordinated technical assistance to member states. Since its inception, UNOTC, under the stewardship of USG Voronkov, has worked effectively in support of a national counter-terrorism capacity building and the implementation of the global counter-terrorism strategy, gaining broad acknowledgement among member states. Member states, in turn, in large numbers, made serious efforts to implement Resolution 1373 and carried out practical cooperation in areas such as legislation, law enforcement, finance, border control, and international judicial cooperation, and achieved positive progress along the way. However, at the same time, one must not lose sight of the fact that the international counter-terrorism landscape remains grim and complex. Last year, several serious terrorist attacks took place, including in Europe. At the start of 2021, terrorists unleashed fresh attacks in Niger and Pakistan. China strongly condemns these heinous acts and expressed its deepest sympathy to the family of the victims and the government people of the affected countries. Facts demonstrate that terrorism remains a real threat facing the international community in its entirety. COVID-19 pandemic has accentuated economic and social challenges which may worsen the vicious cycle of uncertainties, instabilities, and violence, and lead to resurgence of international terrorism. In view of this, the international community must maintain high vigilance, foster a sense of community of shared future for mankind, and take a holistic approach to jointly fight terrorism in all its forms. China wishes to emphasize the following. First, deepen consensus and consolidate the broadest unified front to fight terrorism. Terrorism is the common enemy of humanity. Fighting terrorism is the joint call of the international community, and unity is our most powerful weapon in defeating terrorism. This is a truism as demonstrated by the implementation of Resolution 1373 since its adoption 20 years ago. We must, under the leadership of the United Nations, work to build a consensus and send a unified message to terrorists through our coordinated actions. It is important for CTC, CTED, and UNOTC to work in concert to promote and consolidate legal framework at the international, regional, and national levels. At the same time, they should step up their efforts and enhance intelligence sharing and judicial cooperation. China is in favor of concluding negotiations at the earliest on the Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism and hopes that relevant outstanding issues will be properly resolved so as to further enhance the international counter-terrorism legal framework. At present, terrorism in parts of Africa is on the rise. The international community must increase input to help African countries concerned with their counter-terrorism capacity building, thus supporting through concrete actions the efforts by African countries to join forces in fighting terrorism and seeking peace and security. Second, we must abide by a unified standard and reject selectivity in counterterrorism. There are no good or bad terrorists. Any terrorist act, regardless of who the author is, regardless of when and where it happens, and regardless of its pretexts, must be condemned and cracked down in equal measure by us all. There is no room for double standard, nor should there be selectivity in counterterrorism. For the Security Council designated terrorist organizations and individuals, all countries are duty-bound to implement Council resolutions and strictly enforce relevant sanctions. However, it is concerning that a certain Council member, in practice of unilateralism and bullying, has politicized and instrumentalized counterterrorism in an attempt to whitewash terrorism. Their action has seriously hampered international cooperation on counterterrorism and is the main obstacle in the way of the implementation of Resolution 1373. To seek geopolitical advantage through leveraging terrorist networks not only constitutes a betrayal of all victims of terrorism, but also will lead to a situation of self-harm where one lifts the stone only to have it dropped onto one's own feet. Third, our efforts must be better focused to respond effectively to new terrorist trends. In response to new and evolving terrorist challenges, we need new and flexible tools that produce results. We must give special attention to the economic and social fallouts of COVID-19, guard against and prevent terrorists from taking advantage of the pandemic-induced opportunities and disruptions to incite and preach terrorism. The spread of COVID-19 also serves as a reminder that biological terrorism will bring disastrous consequences in stark contrast to its low cost. Internet is a major counter-terrorism battlefield. Terrorist groups have used the internet to spread extremist ideology, instigate terrorist activities, recruit personnel, and engage in financing. And all these illegal activities remain unabated even as we speak. The international community should step up cooperation and make sure that the internet does not become a free haven for terrorists. The issues of FTFs in detention in Syria and Iraq must not be left in limbo indefinitely. The Council needs to decide on how to approach it politically and formulate a legal framework without delay to resolve this issue. Fourth, better efforts at prevention to eliminate the root causes of terrorism. It is necessary to take a holistic approach with a combination of political, economic, legal, and social measures to root out the breeding ground for terrorism and extremism. We must uphold the principles of equality, respect, and tolerance, promote dialogue among different civilizations, and reject the narrative of the so-called clash of civilizations. Promotion of economic and social development and poverty reduction are of critical importance in fighting terrorism. There must be a greater sense of urgency in addressing development issues, especially youth education and employment. We call upon countries to enhance experience sharing and adopt preventive counter-terrorism and de-radicalization measures such as vocational training and community-based correction programs in order to help fragile countries in strengthening their counter-terrorism capacity building. Mr. President, before concluding my statement, I want to respond to the statement made by the UK representative. The UK representative deviated from the theme of today's debate and launched the groundless attacks against China, which we firmly reject and refute. As a victim of terrorism, China has taken resolute measures to firmly fight terrorism and extremism. Our action is reasonable, is based on law, and conforms to the prevailing practice of countries of the world. Our action has offered strong safeguard of the fundamental interest and legitimate rights of different ethnicities of our country, produced visible results, and are well received and broadly received by our population. The various narratives on Xinjiang are purely political motivated. They are devoid of any facts and are a sham political game through and through. We urge relevant countries to stop fabricating lies, stop practicing double standard on counter-terrorism, and stop interfering in China's internal affairs. Thank you, Mr. President.
السفير على هذه المداخلة الهامة.
I thank the Ambassador of China for his statement. We have thus heard the last speaker for this session. We've reached the end of the list of speakers. Personally, I was delighted to be able to participate in this rich discussion. We shared our concerns as regards the phenomenon of terrorism, which is a threat to international peace and security. We also focus on the importance of remaining vigilant when we're faced with this challenge. It is also important to continue our collective action to strengthen international cooperation and to fight against this phenomenon, which has no religion, colour or identity. We must try to attack the root causes of this scourge, which fuels violence and conflict. In this discussion, we have all underscored our commitment to fight terrorism and to intensify the efforts of the UN system for counter-terrorism, particularly the CTC and CTED. The aim here is to fight against this criminal phenomenon that is ever so complex. In order to do this, we need to support the capacity of states, and we must also keep up with the development and evolution of manifestations of terrorism and fight against its spread. I thank you very much once again. I thank you, speakers, for your briefings, Mr. Voronkov, Ms. Conins, and Ms. Akilu. We listened to the statements from the various ministers very carefully today, too. We were very interested to hear from the ministers and ambassadors. I would also like to thank member states and regional groups, as well as the international organizations who submitted written statements for our discussion today. The statements that we will be receiving until the end of the day will form part of the compilation of statements on this session, and we are looking forward to receiving more contributions. Personally, I followed the various interventions very closely. As someone who is also preparing for was drafting for, as part of the drafting of Resolution 1373 in 2001, when my country, Tunisia, was member of the Security Council. Then, in that case, I would like to offer my greetings to all my colleagues who are members of the Security Council then, at that time, and thank them for the excellent work that we managed to achieve. I am confident that what we managed to achieve came at the right time to fight terrorism. Our actions at the time contributed and will contribute, thanks to our current efforts, to making our world a better place. In conclusion, thank you all once again for the adoption of the presidential statement, which will be published following this session. I'd like to thank you again once for your contribution and your kind attention. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much indeed.